Okay.
Hello there, and welcome
wait,
to
wait, not yet. Sorry.
Three times the charm.
Okay. Three,
it says we're live here. Okay.
2, 1. Okay.
All
Now
right.
you're live.
Okay, hello there, and welcome to Explain Apologetics. You're joining me, Samuel Nason, on a wonderful Wednesday morning if you are in the US or anywhere remotely near the US. But for those of you in Malaysia, you've already experienced Wednesday. It's Wednesday night, 10 p.m., I believe, in Malaysia and also in Singapore. It's a joy to be coming live with you doing this live stream. As we tackle the question of biblical authorship, I'm glad and privileged to be joined today by Brother Jonathan Sheffield, who has done a lot of work on this, including debating Matt Dillahunty recently on this exact topic. So pleasure to have you with us, Brother Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Samuel, for having me on today. I've been a big fan of your ministry and all the great things you've been doing. So thank you for having me on your show this morning.
It's a privilege, brother. So just before we get started, I just thought that be great if we could just begin by just explaining a little bit about where you're coming from, and in terms of this in this topic, your recent work with Matt Dillahunty, and also I understand you're going to be debating Dr. Richard Carrier soon on not this topic, but related to patristics and all that. So if you can just give us a background about how you approach this, that would be helpful for our viewers.
Okay, well, over the last probably 4 years, I've kind of dedicated my ministry to defending how we got the books of the New Testament and understanding how records were transferred down and preserved in the ancient churches. And in my most recent debate with Dillahunty, just a little over a month ago, we wanted to talk on the subject of, can we determine who actually wrote the New Testament documents, specifically on the authorship of the Gospels? So that was a really focused discussion to understand in establishing the credibility of our New Testament Gospels. It first helps us understand, where do these documents come from? Who is writing the information that we are being provided with? So that began a nice discussion with Mr. Dillahunty, and kind of leave it at there for right now.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I enjoyed watching your debate with Matt Dillahunty on that topic. And if maybe what we could do is, for those of you who are just joining us, this is a live stream, and the difference between that and the typical interviews we have is that you get to participate in the live stream. It's less of us just talking about the questions that we think it's important, and we want to hear from you as well. So if you do have a question, just type it in the live chat, and we'll be happy to kind of see how we can tackle that question. So back to Brother Jonathan. So you recently did this debate with Matt Dillahunty on the authorship of the gospel. So for someone who has no background knowledge on this, you're starting fresh. How do you explain, or how do you even begin to explain to someone about how we can know the authorship of the Gospels, because and also the other books of the New Testament? Because to someone who is new to this, they probably think that the Gospels came to us with the Greek words kata mateion or something like that right there. But that's not the case, right? It's not as if the New Testament letters actually came with the name of the author itself. This was something that was attributed to them later on. So before we even get to how reliable, I mean, how can we know for sure who authored these books? What would you even begin to explain to someone?
I think it's important, especially when we're talking on this subject, to make it relatable to how would we do it. I mean, because we're talking about the authorship of a book. And if you notice, when I started off my discussion with Dillahunty, is I went to some information from Augustine, who was the Bishop of North Africa towards the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century. Now, he was asked the same specific question. Faustus, who was a Manichaean luminary, had also attacked Christ's words from the Bible. And one of his polemics against the New Testament Gospels were, well, they weren't actually written by an apostle, but some pretender under his name. So what Augustine did in this case is just made it relatable. So how do we know the authorship of any book? So if we look at what Augustine said, he said, well, you know, let's look at the question in broad. Let's look, how would you do this for any book that you have on your shelf, in the palm of your hand? How do you know this? So Augustine actually sets up his discussion and say, well, how do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? He goes on to further explain how is authorship ascertained in each case, except the author having brought his work into public notice as much as possible in his own lifetime, and by the transmission of that information from one another in continuous order, the belief becoming more certain as it become more general up to our own day. And so what I did in the debate is I wanted to establish that the same procedural precedent, or the established way for establishing any book, is going to be also applied to the New Testament Gospels. So one of the examples I provided, just because the atheists in general are a big fan of Lucretius, in around 50 BC, a work attributed to Lucretius called On the Nature of Things was published in the ancient world. So if you think of yourself as an author, how does Lucretius writing this work make his work known to other people so he becomes identified with the author of that work? One of the beautiful things about history and documentation is they provide cooperation on how these works were being made known. And it's interesting is Cicero in around 54 BC is having a communication with his brother who talks about Lucretius's work, and that you need to read this because this is really good. And Cicero is responding back in the letter is, hey, this work was really good as you had already testified. So we have a contemporary reference who is not trying to spread propaganda. It's just, well, my brother told me about this book, I read it, and I'm giving you my insight on how I feel about this book. And so what we start to see is Lucretius made it publicly known. So it got into contact of Cicero's brother. Cicero's brother wrote a letter to him, and they're having this conversation. So when we see that, we also then see down the road Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, who makes a reference to Lucretius's work. And down through the ages, we continually to see quotations and citations for this work, which all points back to Lucretius. The church fathers, because Lucretius attacks, God and the immortality of the soul. Jerome, Isidore of Seville, actually attacked his works. But what we see is from 54 BC down to Jerome's time in 383 AD, the only suspect we have is Lucretius, because it all points back to Lucretius as being the author. So we have corroborated testimony over a wide geographical area by different figures in history that all identify this work with Lucretius.
Right. So what essentially, to summarize for our viewers, what you're essentially saying is this is the same principle we would use for any other book in antiquity. It's the same principle. So if you're going to suspect the early church fathers of foul play, then you might as well go and dismiss the authorship of all the other books as well that we know out there. So in order to remain consistent, there's no reason to suspect any foul play on the parts of the early church fathers. Now, what I find really interesting, and by the way, for those of you watching this, you can ask your questions in the live chat. We've already had one from Matt Solomon. Yeah, we'll get to that real quick, Matt, on Jonathan's participation with the debate. But thanks for your question. So we're talking about this idea where, you know, sometimes skeptics come and they assume that the early church fathers had ulterior motives in trying to attribute the Gospels to, or at least the other books of the New Testaments, to people who it weren't really the authors. What I found really interesting is that the fact that they name these Gospels after people that are relatively unknown seems to be evidence, or at least it lends attestation to the fact that they weren't fabricating the authorship. For example, you don't have a Gospel of Peter, you don't have a Gospel of Paul. You have a Gospel of Mark, and if you didn't know about Mark as the author of the Gospel, you'd be asking, who on earth is Mark? So we know later on through tradition that that Mark's Gospel was actually essentially based on Peter's own works and testimony, and Mark is putting it in. But it shows that the early church fathers, at least with regards to the authorship, are much more interested in saying that it's the Gospel of Luke, it's the Gospel of Mark, instead of attributing it to Paul and Peter, which would be the case if you're trying to fake something, right?
Yeah, no, that's a very excellent point that you make. Obviously, we actually have publications of Gnostic Gospels where obviously they use the names Peter. So we have the Gospel of Peter in the Gnostic text, the Evangeline of James. Because if you think about it, you know, who was on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus but Peter, John, and James the Greater? So why not use names like Peter, James, and Thomas, which were actually used and published under those names by the so-called Gnostic texts, to kind of throw different disinformation out there, saying, hey, look, we actually got the most important gospel works. I mean, why use Matthew? Now, if you look historically, it makes sense. Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman Empire. He would have naturally kept records. We know shorthand had existed in the area under their control for the last 300-400 years at least. He would have recorded tax revenue that he took in. So obviously, keeping records for the group as its scribe would have made sense. You know, the information that we receive from, you know, Papias, Clement of Alexandria, from Irenaeus, even from 1 Peter. 1 Peter identifies Mark as being in Rome, that Peter describes as Babylon, with him there. So he's in the area, he's in the location. We know of Christianity's early arrival to Rome from Suetonius, who shows that the Jews were very upset at the Christians' arrival in Rome. So we know the Christians were going there. Peter was preaching to people in Rome, and we have corroborating testimony from Eusebius, Papias, Clement of Alexandria, and Irenaeus that Mark was Peter's scribe who took his information in Rome, and Peter authorized the reading of that book in the churches. And when we go to all the churches, this is the same common history that we find out in Mark's church in Alexandria, because we know after he left Rome, he went over to Alexandria and set up the Greek and Coptic churches over there, where he became its first bishop. And so we had something objective to go down to. It's almost like going to the publishing house. You go to the publishing house and you say, who is the author of these works? And because the churches, the institution itself, the community of believers, they are witnesses of what had come down, because the authors would have had, because they're in possession of the book, they have information on where they got these records from.
Absolutely, great response, Jonathan. So like to just now again remember, for those of you watching, this is not the typical interview where I ask the questions and get the answers. This is a live stream where you get to ask questions, and I want to say this: the questions don't necessarily have to be confined merely to the authorship of the Bible. You can actually have the questions on anything pertaining to the Bible, the authorship, the transmission, the alleged corruption of the Bible that tends to come up every now and again. So let's go with the first question that we have out there. Just if you have a question, again, just type it in the live chat and we'll be happy to address it. It doesn't have to be specifically to the topic of the authorship. But the first question actually comes from Matt Solomon, who is a known apologist himself. Like I said, it's a privilege to be interacting with you here, Matt, if you're watching this. Matt says, wondering if Jonathan will be debating Bart Ehrman on this subject anytime in the near future.
Well, actually, back in 2017, I got an email from Dr. Bart Ehrman, who I had questions for, and I was challenging some of his theories publicly. So he did invite me on his blog in July of 2017. And we spent probably about 6 weeks in a sort of de facto debate on his blog, answering questions regarding transmission. We talked about Pericope adultery. We talked about New Testament authorship for the Gospels. I have published 3 videos on my channel recreating that de facto debate with Dr. Bart Ehrman. But to follow up on the question, I know James and I from Modern Day Debate are trying to reach out to Dr. Bart Ehrman to actually kind of commence an official dialogue on the channel with Dr. Ehrman on these issues. So that is a work in progress.
Absolutely. And I mean, something in my heart tells me there's going to be a hefty price tag on that one. So,
Yes.
As is the case with some of these great more established speakers out there in terms of skeptics. But the next question we have is a really good question next from Pastor John Yin. Thank you, Pastor John, for your question. His question is, why would Gnostic Gospels even exist then? We tend to get a lot of questions about the Gnostic Gospel. So go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I think one important thing to note about Christianity is we did not have any central authority, especially looking in the first century, the second century, the third century. There was no unified or central bishop or central authority over the independent Greek, Latin, and Aramaic apostolic churches. So if we compare this to, we didn't have a caliph, we didn't have an Uthman, we didn't have a central figure in Christianity that was dictating terms and prescriptions for the churches. These churches were very independent. Another important to understand is Christianity was not given a legal status to worship in public temples throughout the Roman Empire. It was a secret organization per se. If we look at Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan, he had to produce an edict against the Christians of his time in the early 2nd century, outlawing them from assembling together in secret because they didn't have that legal right to do so. So the Gnostic groups, if you think about it, Christianity was becoming, popularized throughout the empire. Tacitus tells us that it had already made its way through Judea and Rome. Pliny, who was the governor of Bithynia, it spread throughout Turkey. So Christianity didn't have a central figure to monitor these other groups in terms of, it was out of their hands. Other groups were able to publish other documentation outside of the official churches that they rose their hand up and said, hey, this is the true Bible. And as we can see with the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian and Hippolytus, they're actually responding to those allegations that they were in possession of the true text.
Fantastic response. We do have a next question coming up, and maybe if we have time, I would love to, just add on to the Gnostic Gospels, because I think that's a really, really fascinating subject. We've had Dr. Stephen Boyce, who is a good friend of Jonathan, joining us on Explain Apologetics maybe a couple of weeks ago, dealing with the canonicity of the scripture, where the issue of the Gnostic Gospels came up. But I do want to go quickly to Kaylin's question, and I know that you have a different response from the likes of Dr. James White and the others on this issue. Do share with us your view on the Pericope adultery. Kaylin Moy says, the Pericope adultery, yes to it being inspired scripture or not.
Yes, obviously, I definitely have a difference. I know Dr. Boyce and I are really good friends. He does an excellent job on the Gnostic Gospels. A lot of his work I have used in my debate with Dillahunty, and we share a lot of the same perspective on these issues. There's a couple of differences, but we are very close on our understanding of this issue. For me, it comes down to the very same perspective. So when we look at the four Gospels, just to give a kind of parallel, how do we explain that almost all the independent Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic apostolic churches come up with the same books, naming the same authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, unless it does go back to the apostles, because we see common history throughout a vast geographic area in different languages coming up with the same information. So when we look at the Pericope adultery in particular.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, maybe could you just also share with us where that is as well, because some people may not be familiar with the term of Pericope adultery.
Yes, the Pericope adultery in most cases is found in John. So we're looking at John 7:53 through John 8:11. That section in there is where it's mostly found in the manuscript tradition that we find. So, so when we look at that section of John, and remember, we have this objective framework. The churches themselves are both witnesses and guardians to the text. So when we talk about this, this understanding of how does the text from the first century that was handed down to the churches come down to the fourth, we have what we know that Augustine talks about, Irenaeus and Tertullian, as this legal chain of custody. So it was handed over to the bishops. Their job as bishop and for the congregation was to oversee the text, so it would be transferred down to posterity. Now, once again, because of what's limited in antiquity, the natural presumption is only so much is going to survive. But because we have bishops such as Ambrose speaking from the pew in the 3rd century, Augustine writing on his sermons, Jerome, who was an amazing textual critic of the 4th century, who's actually dealing with textual variation, what we find is this passage of scripture found its way into the churches. So when we look at the churches, we find this scripture in their Bibles. So they're preaching from it, they're giving commentary on it throughout the churches in the ancient world, which witnesses in those churches trace back to the original. So the natural assumption would be is you have all these independent witnesses throughout the 4th century that trace back to the apostles. What is the most best explanation except it must go back to the 1st century? And with that said, Augustine, who was a bishop of North Africa, does explain that this passage, because of how adultery was viewed even today in a lot of the part of the Eastern Empire, why it was possibly being taken out of the scriptures. We have Nikon, a Greek, telling us in the 9th century that the passage was being removed. Augustine corroborates that information in his area in North Africa. And we see Ambrose, a bishop in Milan, speaking about the problems this passage and what it seemed to imply to his congregation in there. So we have two definite references that it was being taken out of biblical scriptures. But the big thing is, how does it get into all these textual traditions, the Greek and Latin that Jerome says it was in before 383, unless it does go back to the originals?
All right. The reason I can't stop, I can't contain my laughter is because Dr. Stephen Boyce is actually in the live chat and is blasting away. So there are questions that come before that. And by the way, for those of you who are watching this and don't know, Dr. Stephen Boyce is an expert on this area, as is Jonathan. And they're both good friends. So I'm just going to go to his question because it's related to this question, and then I'll go back to the previous questions as well. So Stephen Boyce actually says, let me go back to the first comment he made. He says, "Oh, come on, Jonathan, the Pericope adultery is a later addition and you know it." I'll read all his comments so that you get to respond to them. He says, "Yes, it's not in the earliest witness, friend. LOL. Then his final comment is, "That was one location. That doesn't explain the rest of the world." So yeah, I'll let you respond to all three of his comments.
Yeah, and Dr. Boyce and I, we've had many conversations on the phone. We did a really good discussion together on Joshua Gibbs' program as well. And when we talk about witnesses, and this is where Dr. Boyce and I would disagree. Now, he is correct. We have biblical documentation from the ancient world dated sometime in the 2nd century up to the 4th century that does not contain this information, which gives rise to the theory that could this passage has been interpolated, which he is correct. It does ask that question. We have earlier documentation from the 2nd century with P75, P76. We obviously have Sinaiticus and Vaticanus in the 4th century, which are the two big witnesses against this verse as well. The question is, we have documentation, but what establishes those documents as being witnesses of the text that were actually read in the official churches? So when I look at Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, while I don't attack the text as whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, is we don't know where they come from. So in the ancient world, documents as such would be considered apocryphal because we cannot establish its provenance of these texts. Dr. Tommy Wasserman makes the same point on Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. We don't know where they come from. Whereas, the Bishop of Milan, we understand the history of that particular church that he's preaching from on the text. So that church goes back. The Church of Rome that Jerome is doing doing the Latin Vulgate for, as evinced in his prologue. The Church of Rome has standing and credibility. We understand the history and origins of that church. That church goes back to the apostles. And in the Vulgate, that passage was in there. We know Jerome's methodology. And in North Africa, another major epicenter of Christianity, we do see Augustine and the Bishop of North Africa vetting Jerome's Vulgate against actual Greek texts. And that passage is in there as well. So the question is, we have major epicenters of Christianity that trace back to the apostles that have this verse, and we have documents that we can't ascertain its provenance that is missing it. So we understand how the churches were set up and organized. We know there was a system to preserve the text, down through the ages. So why would we abandon what was received from the churches for texts of unknown provenance?
All right. Well, that's adding a lot of spice in the live chat. But that's great. That's what it's for. It'll be great one day to have both Jonathan and Dr. Stephen Boyce together on the channel and basically give our viewers a taste of how that sort of an interaction would go down. But the next question is from Marcus Lee. He says, adding on to Kalen's question, would the ending of Mark be counted as scripture? I presume he's referring to the longer ending of Mark. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I had a pretty extensive serialized debate with Dr. Richard Carrier on his blog at I think it was the beginning of 2000, at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. Because remember, according to Dr. Richard Carrier, Mark was first. And Matthew and Luke are redactions from Mark. John is a later theological development. And then the churches, started adding on passages such as the last 12 verses of Mark for theological reasons. So his whole theory is that there was an evolutionary development of the canon, which was created to support their theological propaganda. So you had all these passages in there to kind of frame the type of Christ we were trying to promote to the Christian world. So, so as to authenticity, we followed the same process. So the independent Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches. So if we look at the textual tradition in the Greek, the Latin, and the Aramaic, so we're talking about the Peshitta, we're talking about the Vulgate, we're talking about the Syrian Byzantium text form. The last 12 verses of Mark found its way into 3 independent textual traditions of the apostolic churches. It's part of the church's liturgical and festival system. It's found in their ancient versions. We have testimony as early as the 2nd century with Irenaeus preaching it from Gaul. And we even have Tatian, who included it in his Diatessaron in the 2nd century. And once again, what we talked about authorship at the very beginning, we talked about how did that work become known. Now, Mark made his work known throughout the churches of Rome and throughout there. And when we examine the objective framework of the apostolic churches, we see that that passage had come down through the churches. Chrysostom at Antioch, the oldest surviving church, Greek church going back to the apostles in 385, does a commentary on it in Corinthians. Jerome was very aware of Eusebius's comments on it, and it made it into the Vulgate. We even see Victor of Antioch, who had read Eusebius' comment and does an investigation on that passage and found it to be official. So they were very well aware of textual variation, but they were able to independently vet the source and make sure it was scripture. And so we see it in 3 different textual traditions and throughout the culture of the church, from its liturgy to its text and to its festivals.
All right, that's yeah. For those of you who are watching back home and you're thinking that, wait, this is way above what I can understand. I don't have a clue what this is about. What you could do is also, you can always drop a question on the live chat right now and just maybe ask to clarify on any points that will help you, or at least phrase a simpler question that will be of help to you, because we do realize that but what Jonathan is sharing about and what some of the questions that are coming assume a lot of prior reading and understanding about what went on in early church history. But I mean, that's clearly, we are open for all ranges of questions. It's our desire that you get introduced to this, and that this somehow whets your appetite to go even deeper into the text. The next question is from Kalen again. Thanks, Kalen, for your questions. And Kalen says, what would you say to Bart Ehrman's point that there aren't any first century manuscript, but only second century manuscript? He says, I can't remember whether he was talking about the gospel or epistles. I've had the privilege of going to England in the University of Manchester, John Ryland's library, and actually looking at the P52, I think is the Papyri 52, which is there. I couldn't find it at first. It's not a very easy place to find where it is, but I did find it in the end. Yeah, so that's dated to about 125 AD. He's asking, how would you respond to Bart Ehrman, who says we don't have any first century manuscripts available to us?
True. We, you know, and the natural presumption is documentation from over 2,000 years ago is not going to survive. Obviously, if you're using it all the time, it's not going to be preserved. We know Diocletian during the period of 298 through 310 ran a campaign on purging Christian sources from the Roman Empire for a 10-year period. So there was a lot of destruction of manuscripts historically that we known to be destroyed. So from a question of antiquity and historical documentation, over 2,000 years ago when we had all these wars ravaged the land, there was a lot of fires, you know, stuff is not going to survive from that period. But we do have the churches. So the Church of Rome, the Church of Thessalonica, the Church of Philippi, the Church of Corinth, all these churches still exist. The Antiochian Church, even though it has physically moved, no longer in Syria, it did move over, I believe, to Damascus. That church still exists. So while we don't have actual documentation from the first century, we do have the churches. And because the churches were spread out, they were independent, they were fighting over the date of Easter. What we do find is basically the same accounts of Jesus's birth, life, death, and resurrection in every single one of those. And we find this in the Peshitta. We find this in the text of the Greek Orthodox Church. We find this in the Latin churches. So 3 different textual traditions, and we have more. We find the same life, death, resurrection of Jesus, and the same writings basically throughout. So in any normal court of law, this would be conclusive. Where witnesses didn't collude, this would be conclusive in any normal court of law.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. So, I mean, if you're looking at the fact that we have manuscript, or at least a fragment that dates as early as 125 AD, the P52, tells you a lot actually about how close a manuscript tradition we have that is to the you know, the original autographs that the apostles wrote. Because if you go and look, for example, at Caesar's Gallic Wars or other materials in antiquity, you need a good 400 years before you actually have a written record, never mind a manuscript, because the manuscript comes centuries later. The fact that you don't have it in the first century, it's not a problem at all. It's not a problem at all. It's sometimes, I think, there's an unnecessarily, they set the bar far too high in a way that they wouldn't do for any other literature out there. If you,
And that's exactly, Samuel makes an excellent point, because obviously I brought up Lucretius in my debate with Matt Dillahunty, because we only had one recently rediscovered copy of Lucretius, just one from 1417. So 1400 years after, and there's no doubt in any historian's mind that that isn't the work of Lucretius. One copy that the other translations are based on from 1417. No one doubts it. But we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, and we have over 10,000 Latin, over 1,000 Syriac. So when we look at what's available, and the Gallic Wars is the example, very little information, hundred, if not thousands of years after its original publication.
Absolutely. So let's go to the next question, where Kalen says, regards to the authorship of the Gospel of John, some scholars like Paula Gooder mentioned that the Johannine community wrote it. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, so we're talking about the book of John?
Yeah, the Gospel of John.
Okay. So, one of the things is, we have John's churches. Eusebius, who writes on the history of the church, does an account of John writing from Ephesus. This is also corroborated also in Irenaeus's work from Gaul, who was the bishop over that church. He's actually from John's churches. So he was a student in Asia Minor at the Church of Smyrna, where Tertullian and Irenaeus says that Polycarp was bishop over over the churches of Asia Minor, especially in Smyrna. So we have a direct relationship associated with John's churches that John appointed, where this information is coming out of. So the common history that's coming out of Asia Minor from John's churches specifically identifies the Gospel of John with his publication from Ephesus. The Muratorian fragment that comes out from Rome at 170 AD, the history is common there as well, that John wrote it from Ephesus. I don't think anyone can dispute. We have the official church of Ephesus, and we see the same testimony coming out. Tertullian makes reference of this because he's debating with Marcion on these other books that Marcion said, was it really from John? And what he does is he points to the church of Ephesus, which was still existent, that can be used as an objective framework for investigation and say, hey, go there and check for yourself. Those bishops that had received this information all identify this work as coming from John. So once again, we have all these independent witnesses that identify this work with John. So how else do we explain it is from John? Because if we look at the Aramaic churches, they didn't accept Revelation, they didn't accept 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, but they identify the Gospel of John as coming from his pen. So in the eastern part of the empire, in the West, all the reporting agencies or the publishing houses, because there wasn't just one, they all identify. So when we look at different history throughout the churches that trace back to the apostles, they come up with the same testimony. And that's how we identify it. The same way we identify Lucretius's work or Virgil's work on the Aeneid, which we have so little testimony for, we have an overwhelming amount of testimony that all points to John as the author. What other author can they identify or suspect can they bring forward with actual documentation that identifies that work with someone else? There is no other. They're all the same. Obviously, the works of Shakespeare, we have those that were from his studio that were able to bring his documents to light. But in the case of Shakespeare, you have 80 different authors that could have been attributed to his work. You don't have that with the Gospels at all. The testimony is all consistent, which would lead back to the natural conclusion that John is the author.
Absolutely. So let's go to the next question. We have the live chat building up, and keep those questions coming in. We'll try and I'll keep my response short for this next question because it's not directly related to the topic, but it's fine. Cafe says, Nason mentioned, I assume you're referring to me, that's my surname. All right. Nason mentioned mystical experience in his debate with Matt Delahanty. Is Nason familiar with psilocybin-induced research happening at Johns Hopkins University, overseen by Dr. Roland Griffiths? If you've actually watched the debate, and I presume you have, because the question is relevant to that debate, my focus in religious experience, the argument from religious experience, I took pains to actually distinguish religious experience from mystical experience. So they're not essentially the same thing. The Pew Research survey that I brought up actually is a combination of both mystical and religious experience. But my research in the area of religious experience is slightly different. And that's why, for example, the guy who really popularized the argument from religious experience is a guy by the name of William James, who is the father of American psychology. William James is supposed to be one of the guys who started being lecturing psychology in the US. He brought out the argument from religious experience, but he ties it with mystical experience. And I actually didn't reference a lot of his work. Because I didn't want to conflate religious experience with mystical experience. I wanted to stay clear, focusing on religious experience, which is the experience of God, not just experiences of the universe or experiences of some sort of transcendental reality. I wanted to stay clear of that and focus merely on what can we learn about God. And my definition that I presented was, passive, for example, passive religious experience where people actually learn about God. It's not that they're actively pursuing it; it just happens to them. That was the focus of religious experience. So no, I've not approached it with regards to the mystical experience in the way that you described, Dr. Roland Griffith does. But what I did do uh, uh, is to focus on the cognitive science of religion research. That was the area where I actually was working on my uh, Masters of Theology thesis or actually pre-Masters of Theology thesis in Malaysia when I was back in seminary in Malaysia. And what uh, that the idea was about that Deborah Kellerman from Boston University had produced a remarkable research. Title of the research was "Are Children Intuitive Theists?" where she argues that that children show dispositions towards religious tendencies, and she uses words like promiscuous teleology, showing that how children actually are basically hardwired to see agency behind objects. So, for example, she would do a research on ask children about pointy rocks. What are pointy rocks there for? And children would give answers that showed that they believe in some sort of agency or purpose, a purposive view of looking at the world. They would say, for example, it's the pointy rock is there so that animals would not sit on them and crush them, and those kinds of things, as opposed to naturalistic explanations. So what that was the angle I was focusing from, and saying that we have a great I mean, the religious experiences that people are having, which is actually quite widespread all around the world, interestingly, including both Matt Dillahunty and uh, Tom Jump have claimed religious experience. This religious experience is coming not from a delusional state where they're intoxicated and then you're seeing things you're not supposed to be seeing. No, we have good reason to believe this is what is we're naturally experiencing. It's not as a result of being in a state where our cognitive faculty can be questionable as to what we are actually experiencing. So that's the focus. So religious mystical experiences was not my focus, and I don't think that was what I was trying to emphasize at all. I only mentioned that in passing because the Pew Research actually dealt with both. But great question. We do want to go back to the yeah, Cafe also adds that um, also like to ask Nathan if he had mystical experience himself. No, I've not had mystical experiences. I've had religious experience, and I've defined the 5 categories of religious experience in my debate. You have, for example, public ordinary religious experience, where you can experience God from everyday objects, like for example, seeing a sunrise or a sunset, and just feeling the grandeur, experiencing how great God is. And that tells you something about God. It gives you additional information, knowledge about God, that God is this great designer who is so creative. And you get that by that feeling of majesty or transcendence that you get. So this is not mystical. I'm not referring to the mystical one. So I've had experiences of those. And you also have non-specific experiences, where experiences you can't communicate, but you just feel that God is with you. And you have experiences that are non-communicable experiences, like, for example, a calling to go into ministry. that was something I actually felt very strong about. Actually, I was 9 years old when I told my teachers that I wanted to be a pastor one day. At 9 or 10 years old, and I remember that I did this every year. And the reason I did that, I actually later explained, is because I felt that if I didn't do that, I would be offending God. Now, that was how later I found out that I actually have a calling, because I believe that not every Christian should be in full-time ministry. I don't believe that every Christian should be in full-time ministry. I think there's all Christians should be in ministry. We should be serving, but full-time ministry is something else. But I believed in my case, I would be defying God if I continue to have a secular employment and not get involved in ministry. So at the age of 10, in order not to offend God, I actually stated I wanted to be a pastor. And that became a way through which I knew that I was called, the assurance that I was called into full-time ministry. So those would count as religious experiences, but not necessarily mystical experiences. And yes, I have experienced religious, not mystical experience. But back to the topic. I'm sorry, Jonathan, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, no, I think you spoke well on it, very eloquently. It was actually a good learning experience for me too. So very well said.
I'm humbled, brother. Thanks so much. The next one is from, oh yeah, so Stephen Boyce has just added two more comments in. He says, and Papias has the story in the Gospel of Hebrews. I'm sorry, I can't quite recall what he's referring to. He also says that Didymus the blind said it was contained in the Gospels, plural. Do you want to briefly respond to that?
Yeah, so, and this is where we sort of begin our investigation, because we do have a strong allusion from Pius, who was a known associate of the apostles, John and Polycarp as well. So Pius is making a strong allusion to the Pericope adultery, or the woman caught in adultery, that we find in John. So that really starts off with our investigation. So we have Papias bringing up a comment. Now, we do know, and Dr. Boyce has pointed this out too, the Gnostics did take information from the gospel publications, almost similar to like Plutarch. He takes information from Luke and kind of brings it into his work. So we know that other sects of Christianity was taking information from ours. So it's a very early source that brings up a strong allusion. And what we do is we pull on that thread to see, where do we find this? Where do we do the investigation? And the investigation does bring us to Didymus, who is the catechetical teacher in Alexandria. The thing about it is, we do know that Jerome and Rufinus, who was on Jerome's team for the Vulgate, did meet with Didymus. And so if you think about it, if I'm Jerome and I'm doing this big project that I'm getting the rest of the world, the rest of the Christian community is aware of, what do you think you're talking about with that person? Tell me about your project. Why is he there at Alexandria? And this is just speculation on my part, except to look for documentation that he's going to use in his project. And Jerome, while he speaks on many textual variants, he does not say this is one of them, even though he comments on it and he's aware of documents that don't have it. So that's really my comments. And once again, Dr. Boyce is an excellent on this subject. I go to him all the time asking for research. He's obviously helping me with some stuff in my debate with Carrier and even with Dillahunty. So he actually helps prove my argument on the gospel knowledge, because he was able to show that it's found in the works of Polycarp and the Didache, which shows that those earliest or contemporary witnesses to the gospel publication. So,
yeah, and this, I mean, that's so true. And if you haven't quite watched that interview I had with Dr. Stephen Boyce, you can do so. You can just, it's one of our videos. You can look in. It's one of the recent videos as well. We did not too long ago. And where we spoke about the canonicity of the Gospels, and Dr. Stephen Boyce actually addressed the authorship of Hebrews based on his latest research. So that was a really phenomenal work by him. And I'll recommend you to watch that if you haven't already done so. Well, I think we've only got about 2 more questions left. We won't be taking any more new questions. So thank you very much for the questions you have. We'll just tackle in the remaining time that we have. We do have about 5-6 minutes left. We'll try and tackle both the remaining questions. Oh, actually, there are 3 questions. Well, we'll try and cover those 3 before we sign off. So the 3 questions at the end, the last 3, the third would be Colossians by Kalen. Again, Colossians is the phrase "and the Lord Jesus Christ" in Colossians 1:2, an addition in a manuscript, or is it original? Most of the newer translations don't have that phrase. What are your thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Well, once again, we can have discussions about variants. We're going to find them, but between the Vulgate, the Peshitta and the Syrian Byzantium text form, there are differences. What really sparked, the additions, or when we refer to the TR, the Textus Receptus, is Lorenzo Valla. In the 1400s, he did a comparison of 5 Greek texts with 5 Vulgates and realized there were differences. We know Constantinople was sacked by the Turks. A lot of Greeks were coming into Europe to flee from that. And this whole conversation around textual variation, there are differences. But the thing about it is those differences attribute to its independency. So, which all trace back to the apostles. So even though we have these differences, we're still finding the same account of Jesus's life, birth, life, death, and resurrection in them. These differences do not in any way attack its credibility on these small issues, but what they do is they ascertain the consensus that this information is true, and there wasn't a collusion by the church to come together and just make up all these scriptures. Not that I went around the Colossians point, but we can talk on those issues. Once again, is the reading both apostolic and Catholic in the senses, is it universal? Does this reading trace back? And is it found throughout the independent Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches to base our decision on?
All right, thank you for that. Now, Cafe asks again, he asks again about what are our thoughts on the word theoria in the early church tradition. What are your thoughts on that? I think it's referring to the early Christian contemplations, theoria.
I think I'm.
Yeah.
It's probably early. Give me the meaning. Are they talking about like the Norma Sacra or?
No, not the Norma Sacra. I think he's talking about theoria, which is the Greek word for contemplation, and the early church. I think that this actually may be more to do with the topic that I actually covered, which is.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can help explain it. Yeah, there's some things obviously I don't have knowledge on, so yeah, if you could help me out on this would be great.
Yeah, so I think so very brief knowledge of theoria, and that is dealing with the Christian mystical experiences in Eastern Christianity. I think that's where the word was used. So no, unfortunately, I've had very little work done on Eastern Christianity, and also so there's an entire branch of movement called Christian mysticism. You actually, so I studied that when we actually studied spiritual formation in seminary. It's one of those classes I never really enjoyed, but perhaps I should have paid more attention to. For example, there were some weird things that happened in that class, to be honest. Okay, I'm not pouring cold water. I'm not throwing shade at those who teach that class. Maybe there are good people out there that teach that class, but so there were really interesting things you do. For example, you go to they would go to a silent retreat, and you would practice lectio divina. So I'm not a big fan of lectio divina, and if I'm going to take heat for that, so be it. Okay, so but the thing is, yeah. So what you would do is we went to, actually, I remember one of these places in I think it was in Cameron Highlands in Malaysia. We actually went there, and we had a 3-day meditation or spiritual reflection, contemplation. So we actually, among the seminary students, we call it the shut up camp, because it was a silent retreat. You're not allowed to talk for 3 days. But yeah, to answer your question, no, it's not something I've done a lot of work on, or to actually just a basic knowledge that it refers to the contemplation of Eastern Christianity. But no, yeah, so that not able to help much, unfortunately, Cafe. And you did mention, thanks for answering that. Oh, thank you for both for your time. I'm subscribing. Yay, that's great. Thanks for subscribing. And that's a cue as well for those of you who haven't subscribed. Do be like Cafe and subscribe to Explain Apologetics if you want more content like this. We do have a couple of other questions there before we close. And from Marcus, why does Mark not write his gospel in a chronological manner for some parts? The order of certain events are different from Luke.
So, when we look at how Mark composed his gospel, what information do we have available? And once again, we have Papias, who's the bishop of Hierapolis. We have Clement of Alexandria giving us history from Alexandria. We have Irenaeus, we have Eusebius, we have Augustine, we have Jerome. So once again, the accounts that we're getting, and there are some minor discrepancies between the details, but they're coming up with the same basic material facts in the case, that Mark is taking this information from Peter's sermons. Peter is preaching throughout the city of Rome, and Mark, who is his scribe, is taking that information and compiling it into a summary format. Because what we see in a sermon is this quick summation of events. So when you look at the first chapter of Mark, how quickly he is jumping from event to event to event. I mean, some accounts only have like a scripture or two, and then he's going right into the next detail, which fits with the literary form of what a sermon is like. It's going through just a summary of information. And when we look at the last part of Mark, we see the same thing, and it's a common literary device in novels where they're doing breaks to transition to the end to close things up. So obviously, in Rome, you can start to bore the crowd very easy. So what you want to do is get a quick break and you want to finish up. And so the main thing in there is we're not taking our information from any hypothesis or hypothetical document that over the last 200-300 years they've come out with. This is from the actual written accounts from those closest to the churches and the apostles, with Irenaeus, who says Mark is doing a summary from Rome from Peter's sermons. This is the same information that we're seeing from Clement of Alexandria and Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis. They're giving us the same account, so it would naturally fit and be consistent with a summary of Peter's sermons in Rome. And that's what we see. We're not getting into a detailed account like we see in Luke, because once again, Acts is following Paul during his ministry. So you see a lot of details in there. The inscription at Delphi on Gallio's proconsulship, you're seeing the details as a historian, as a physician that Luke was composing it. Mark is taking sermons that are being preached from Rome, so you're seeing a different literary approach to how he compiled that information. Obviously, Matthew, being a publican, tax collector, he's approaching it from his form as well. So that's why we see what we do in Mark.
Great response. And we'll go. One of the things I've noticed in Mark, and just to add on to what you said, is that his intention is just to show Jesus as the Son of God. That's why he starts out. I mean, verse 1 is about the only commentary you get from Mark in the entire gospel. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Everything else is pam, 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 full of stories, stories that actually basically boil down to the fact that the disciples kind of get that Jesus is the Son of God, but they don't quite know what that means. So Peter would say that Jesus, you are the Son of God. And the next minute he would say to Jesus, you can't die. How can you die? And Jesus said, well, oh my goodness, you don't understand what the Son of God means. Get behind me, Satan. And you have this kind of understanding where the disciples kind of get he's the Son of God, but they don't quite know what that entails. Finally, the only guy, and bear in mind, Mark is written to a Roman audience. The only guy, interestingly, in Mark, who actually understands what does it mean to say Jesus is the Son of God, and to understand that how his death is actually connected to that, was the Roman centurion who was tasked to kill him. It was that Roman centurion at the end that says, truly this man was the Son of God after Jesus had died. So Mark is actually arranging his gospel in such a way that would actually emphasize that point. And that's why actually, that's one of the reasons why Mark actually is not very concerned. You see that the disciples, the women even at the end are confused. That actually fits into the narrative of Mark, that the people around Jesus didn't quite get it. The Roman centurion who killed Jesus got it. Christianity is not an enemy to Rome by any means. It was, in fact, the Roman centurion that understood the death of Jesus had to do with him being the Son of God. But one last question before we go. And actually, it's not a question. We're done with the questions. It's just a comment from Dr. Stephen Boyce again. He says, the last chapter of John, the writer writes that he's the disciple that was supposed to survive until Jesus came back. So I guess that's dealing with the authorship of the Gospel of John.
Yeah, I know in Mormon tradition, that John never died. He's kind of walking around the earth, just seeing what's happening. I kind of use that in the Mormons. Well, he didn't die, so there was no great apostasy that actually happened. So,
but what's really interesting is that actually John says that Jesus did not say he would not die. I think if anything, John kind of squashes that myth. So that's really interesting. Okay, so I think thank you all for your thoughts and comments. So Cafe recommends looking at Russian theologian Vladimir Lusky. We'll have a look at that, though. I'll definitely just have a look at who that is, but may not be directly related to the work that we are doing. I want to say thank you, Jonathan, for the amount of time you've put in. This has been a blast. Just going through, and your knowledge of the early church history is phenomenal. And thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me on here, Brother Sam. It's been a great honor to be on here with you.
Well, we look forward to having you with us again in the near future, and hopefully we'll try and rope in Dr. Stephen Boyce as well, if he's able to. And I assure you, for those of you watching, I hope that you would actually use this. Use what we've gone through as an interest starting point to actually get into reading about the early church history. I had a conversation with Jonathan just a few days ago, and I was asking him, so where do you really start if you want to actually work on? If you're going to give someone an introduction to the early church fathers, where would you start? And he recommended starting with Tertullian. No, sorry, you actually recommended starting with Eusebius and working through that through Tertullian and Irenaeus. That's right.
That's correct.
Right. Yeah. So go to the sources themselves. Also, of course, if you're a seminary student or if you have general interest in church history, you could just read an overview of it by the books like Bruce Shelley, Church History in Plain Language. Those give you the overview, but you really want to get to the actual sources themselves and explore that for yourself. So until next time, it's been a joy on behalf of Jonathan Sheffield and myself, Samuel Nason. We hope you've enjoyed this. If you haven't subscribed, you can do so. And until next time, bye for now.
God bless.
God bless as well.